Chapter 1. Richard Lawson was not a remarkable man. At 45, he had resigned himself to the idea that the best years of his life had somehow slipped through his fingers, like grains of sand he never even bothered to grasp. His days were a bland repetition of the same tasks, processing insurance claims at a desk in a building that smelled faintly of mold and stale coffee, coming home to his wife Anne, a woman he once loved but now only tolerated, and watching reruns of shows that no longer amused him. Nights were spent in a daze, a glass of whiskey in his hand, eyes glued to the flicker of the television, more for noise than for company. Richard wasn't a bad man, but he was a man who had never really lived. He'd accepted this life, this slow erosion of purpose, because truth be told, there wasn't much else. There never had been. He'd never dreamed big, never taken risks. And now, at 45, the only thrill left in his life was the slight hum of the alcohol in his veins, dulling the edges of another wasted day. It was a typical Tuesday morning when it all started. He was waiting for the bus on Main Street, like he did every weekday, the wind cold and biting as it whipped through the cracked brick of the small town he'd called home for the last decade. The sky was an unrelenting gray, clouds hanging low, threatening snow but never delivering. Everything felt muted. Gray skies, gray streets, gray people trudging through their gray lives. Across from him, sitting on the cold metal bench, was an older woman. He'd seen her before, Mrs. Halverson. She lived a few blocks away from him, always walking with that tiny dog of hers. She wasn't walking today, though. She was hunched over, clutching her worn-out purse in her lap, breathing heavily. She looked tired, more so than usual. Richard glanced at her, and, for the briefest moment, something strange happened. A flash. Just a second. Less than a second, really. But in that moment, he saw it all. Mrs. Halverson slumped over in her living room, a cup of tea spilling from her hand, the sound of the clock ticking louder and louder until the last chime of 8:15 p.m. Her face contorted in pain, hand clutching at her chest, as she gasped for breath that never came. A heart attack. It was so vivid, so real. The details, the faded floral print on the couch, the dim glow of the lamp in the corner, the slow, inevitable silence that followed her last breath. Richard blinked, and the vision was gone. He shook his head, feeling a faint chill creep up his spine. What the hell was that? Stress, probably. He'd been feeling off lately, more tired than usual. It was probably just his mind playing tricks on him, some weird daydream brought on by the cold air and lack of sleep. He pushed the thought aside, shoving his hands deep into his coat pockets as the bus pulled up. But the image lingered in the back of his mind all day, like a dark cloud hovering just outside his peripheral vision. At work, he couldn't focus. The usual drone of paperwork and phone calls felt distant, almost surreal. Mrs. Halverson's face, twisted in pain, kept coming back to him, that final, desperate breath. By the time he got home that evening, the unease had settled deep in his bones. Anne barely looked at him when he walked in the door, her eyes fixed on some reality show that made him feel even more detached from his own existence. He mumbled something about a rough day and headed straight for the liquor cabinet. The whiskey burned as it slid down his throat, but it didn't quiet the image. He could still see her, still hear the ticking of that damn clock. It was just a weird dream, that's all, nothing more. But then, right as he was pouring his second glass, the phone rang. "Richard," Anne called out, her voice flat and uninterested. "It's the Johnsons. They said Mrs. Halverson died today. Heart attack." His blood went cold. The glass slipped from his hand, shattering against the floor. 8:15 p.m. He didn't know how he knew it, but he did. That vision, it wasn't some strange hallucination, some stress-induced nightmare. It was real. A shiver crawled up his spine, cold and relentless, as he stared at the shattered glass, the amber liquid seeping into the cracks of the kitchen floor. His mind raced, trying to grasp what had happened, but there was no logical explanation. How could he have known? Anne mumbled something else from the living room, but her words were distant, muffled, as if coming from the other side of a thick fog. Richard felt the walls closing in. The room, the house. It all felt too small, too tight. He stumbled to the bathroom and splashed water on his face, trying to shake the growing dread that gnawed at the edges of his mind. When he looked up into the mirror, his face seemed different, as though a veil had been lifted and something darker lurked just beneath the surface. And for the first time in his life, Richard Lawson felt truly afraid. The rest of the night passed in a haze, the weight of what he'd seen pressing down on him with the force of 1,000 unspoken questions. Could it have been a coincidence? A twisted premonition brought on by some subconscious cues? But deep down, he knew it wasn't. It couldn't be. As he lay in bed that night, staring up at the ceiling, the oppressive silence of the house settled around him. The ticking of the clock on the nightstand was loud, too loud. He closed his eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. All he could see was Mrs. Halverson gasping for air that never came, and all he could hear was that damn ticking. Chapter 2. The visions didn't stop. If anything, they grew more frequent, more intense, creeping into Richard's life like shadows that never quite receded. They came without warning, sometimes a flash when he least expected it, other times a slow, creeping dread that built up until the scene unfolded in vivid, agonizing detail. Each time, it left him rattled, breathless, and haunted by the inevitability of it all. At first, he tried to ignore it. After Mrs. Halverson's death, he convinced himself it was just a freak coincidence. His brain, stressed and tired, had pieced together some bizarre prediction from a series of cues he hadn't consciously registered. That's all it was. It had to be. But the next day, standing in line at the coffee shop, he glanced at the young barista behind the counter. She was smiling, her dark hair pulled back in a messy bun, taking orders with the casual ease of someone who had done it 1,000 times before. And then, without warning, it hit him. A flash, a car crash, metal twisting and screeching as the vehicle crumpled like a tin can. The barista trapped inside, her face bloodied, eyes wide with panic, as flames licked up from the dashboard. She wouldn't make it. 2 months. That's all she had left. Richard staggered backward, nearly dropping his coffee, his heart pounding in his chest like it was trying to escape. The image burned in his mind, vivid and undeniable, just like Mrs. Halverson's death had been. He left the coffee shop in a daze, walking the familiar streets without seeing them, lost in the terrifying realization that something was very, very wrong with him. That night, after a silent dinner with Anne, another awkward meal in a long series of uncomfortable silences, Richard decided to tell her. He needed to tell someone, and she was his wife, wasn't she? They were supposed to share things, to help each other through difficult times. But as the words left his mouth, the look on her face told him everything he needed to know. "Richard, are you hearing yourself?" she said, shaking her head, her voice edged with exasperation. "You're telling me you can... What? See when people are going to die? Come on." "I'm serious," he said, his voice strained, desperate. "I saw Mrs. Halverson's death. I saw that barista today. It's stress," Anne interrupted, waving him off. "You're overworked. You're tired. I mean, really, Richard? Do you even hear what you're saying? You're not special. You're just imagining things." "Anne, it's real," he insisted, but the words sounded hollow, even to him. How could he convince her when he wasn't sure he believed it himself? She stared at him for a long moment, her expression softening into something like pity. "Go to bed," she finally said, her voice quieter now. "You'll feel better in the morning." But Richard didn't sleep that night. The vision of the barista haunted him. Her wide, terrified eyes burned into his brain. He saw her crash over and over again in his mind's eye, each time as real and vivid as the last. He couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was happening to him, something beyond his control. The next day at work, he avoided looking at anyone for too long. He kept his head down, shuffled through the paperwork, and prayed the visions wouldn't come. But they did. Oh, they did. Around noon, his boss, Mr. Swanson, stepped into his office to check on a case. Swanson was a stout, balding man with a booming voice that always seemed too large for his short frame. As he stood over Richard's desk, explaining some issue with a claim, Richard glanced up. A flash. Swanson, lying on the floor of a convenience store, blood pooling beneath him, a gunshot wound tearing through his chest. The cash register opened, bills scattered across the floor. The thief running, the bell above the door jingling as he disappeared into the night. 3 months. Richard jerked his head down, his breath catching in his throat. He felt like he might vomit. "You all right, Lawson?" Swanson asked, his voice suddenly sharp, suspicious. I'm fine," Richard stammered, barely able to meet his boss's eyes. Just tired." Swanson grunted, clearly unimpressed, and moved on, leaving Richard alone in the suffocating silence of his office. 3 months. That was all Swanson had left. Richard couldn't stop it. Every time he looked at someone for too long, it came. The barista, Swanson, the elderly woman who sat beside him on the bus the next morning, each one marked by a vision of their death. Some were peaceful, a quiet passing in their sleep, a heart that simply stopped beating. But most weren't. Most were violent, tragic, a reminder that life could end brutally and without warning. His best friend Carl was no exception. Richard had known Carl since college. They weren't close, not anymore, but they still grabbed a beer together every now and then. They'd sit at the same bar they'd been going to for years, trading the same old stories, reminiscing about the days when life had seemed wide open and full of possibility. That Friday, as Carl talked about some road trip he and his wife were planning, Richard made the mistake of looking too closely at it. A flash. Carl's car skidding off the road, tires screeching as it spun out of control. The guardrail giving way, the vehicle plummeting down the embankment. The impact, glass shattering. Carl slumped over the steering wheel, blood trickling from a wound on his forehead, his body limp and lifeless. 2 years. Richard's hand trembled as he set down his beer, his face pale and clammy. Carl kept talking, oblivious, laughing at something that now seemed impossibly trivial to Richard. 2 years. He had 2 years left. After that night, Richard stopped meeting Carl for drinks. He stopped going out altogether. Every face he passed on the street became a death sentence waiting to happen. Every pair of eyes hiding a fate that he couldn't unsee. Strangers, friends, co-workers, they were all just ticking clocks, their lives measured by the countdowns that now haunted Richard's every waking moment. He quit looking people in the eye. It was easier that way. If he didn't see, he didn't have to know. But the world felt smaller, darker, like the shadows were creeping in around him. His apartment, once a haven from the monotony of work, felt like a tomb. The air was thick, cold, the walls too close, the darkness too complete. Even Anne, sitting across from him at dinner, felt distant, like a ghost that had already moved on. The visions were a curse, yes, but they were also something else, something he didn't want to admit even to himself. There was a grotesque fascination in knowing, in seeing the end. It was morbid, it was sick, but it was there, gnawing at the edges of his mind. He couldn't stop himself from wondering who would be next. And that was the worst part of all. Chapter 3. By the time Richard tried to save the third person, he had come to a grim realization. Nothing he did could stop what was coming. Worse, his attempts to change the future seemed to accelerate it, to twist fate into something even more grotesque than what he'd originally seen. The first was a coworker, a man named Phil, who worked in the cubicle next to Richard's. He was a quiet guy, kept mostly to himself. But one afternoon, as Richard was heading to the break room, he glanced at Phil and saw it. A car crash, late at night, rain hammering the windshield. Phil, bleary-eyed from a long shift, missed a stop sign. A truck barreled into him, flipping his sedan like a toy, crushing the life out of him instantly. The vision had shaken Richard so much, he cornered Phil after work, his heart pounding in his chest. "Don't drive tonight," he'd said, grabbing Phil by the arm. "Please, whatever you do, don't get in your car." Phil had blinked at him, confused, but he must have seen the desperation in Richard's eyes because he nodded, promised to take a cab home. Richard had felt a small surge of relief then, a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, he could change things. But Phil didn't make it home that night. His cab was struck by a drunk driver at an intersection just 2 blocks from his apartment. The collision killed both him and the driver instantly. Richard had stood at his funeral, staring at the closed casket, feeling the weight of his guilt crushing him. If he hadn't said anything, Phil would still be alive, wouldn't he? Maybe the accident would have happened anyway. Maybe it was inevitable. But Richard couldn't shake the feeling that by warning him, by trying to alter fate, he had brought death to Phil even faster. The second was a young woman, a client he'd met while handling her insurance claim. She was vibrant, full of life, with a laugh that seemed to brighten the drab office. When he saw her death, a fire that would trap her in her apartment, he had tried to warn her too. He told her to check the wiring in her building to make sure there were no hazards. She'd laughed it off, thanked him for the concern, but assured him she was safe. 2 weeks later, her apartment building went up in flames. She died not from the fire, but from smoke inhalation after the fire alarm malfunctioned, leaving her unaware until it was too late. Richard had watched the news footage in horror, the sinking realization setting in. He couldn't change it. Every time he tried, fate twisted around him, darker, sharper, more brutal than before. The visions were no longer just a curse, they were a trap. He was damned to watch people die, unable to do a thing to stop it. It was after the 3rd attempt, after he'd seen Carl's car accident play out in agonizing detail despite all his warnings, that Richard began to unravel. He started seeing death everywhere. The visions came more frequently, unbidden and relentless. Walking down the street, sitting in a diner, even watching TV, everyone was marked, everyone was ticking down toward the inevitable. Anne noticed. She couldn't not notice. He barely spoke anymore, avoiding her gaze, avoiding everyone's gaze. He drank more, slept less, and when he did manage to sleep, his dreams were filled with twisted, nightmarish flashes of the deaths he had seen, or worse, deaths he hadn't seen yet. "You need help, Richard," she'd said one evening, her voice strained, breaking through the silence that had grown like a wall between them. This isn't normal. But what kind of help could he get? What therapist could understand what he was going through? They'd think he was crazy, lock him away. And maybe he was crazy. Maybe this was all some elaborate delusion, his mind playing tricks on him. Except it wasn't. He knew it wasn't. Mrs. Halverson was dead. Phil was dead. Carl was going to die in 2 years. And now, Richard was alone. Not because Anne had left, not yet, but because he had retreated so far inside himself that even when she was in the room, he could no longer feel her presence. It was in one of those late-night spirals, after the whiskey had run out and the walls of his apartment felt like they were closing in on him, that Richard stumbled across something online, an anonymous forum buried deep within the dark corners of the web, a place where people shared stories, impossible stories about seeing things they shouldn't, knowing things they couldn't. The posts were cryptic, disjointed, but there was something there, something that rang true in a way nothing else had since the visions began. They called themselves seers. Richard read for hours, long into the night, until his eyes burned from staring at the screen. There were others like him, people who claimed to see death, people who described the same visions, the same helplessness. And there were hints scattered through the threads of something more, a way out. That's how he found Jonas. The message had come unexpectedly after Richard posted a hesitant reply in one of the threads. It was simple, just a few lines. "I know what you're going through. There's a way to control it, but it comes with a cost. If you're ready to learn more, come see me." There was an address, a place on the outskirts of town, in an abandoned warehouse district. It seemed crazy, reckless, but Richard was beyond caring about that. He was desperate. He needed answers. He needed to know if he could stop this before it destroyed him. He went the next night. The warehouse was cold, the air thick with dust and decay. It smelled of abandonment, of things long forgotten. Inside, he found a small group of people, 6 or 7 maybe, sitting in a circle. They were all different ages, different walks of life, but they shared the same haunted look that Richard had seen in the mirror every morning for months. Jonas stood at the center of them. He was tall, thin, with sharp features that made him look like he was carved from stone. His eyes were piercing, and when he spoke, his voice was calm, controlled, almost soothing. "You've seen it," Jonas said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. "You've seen death, haven't you?" Richard nodded, his mouth dry, his heart pounding in his chest. "It's a gift," Jonas continued, walking slowly around the circle. "But like all gifts, it comes with responsibility. You can see death, but you cannot stop it, not without consequence." Richard felt a flicker of hope at those words. "You mean I can change it?" Jonas stopped, turning to face him, and for the first time, there was something hard in his gaze. "Yes, you can change it, but you must understand, the universe has a balance. If you save a life, another life must be taken in its place. It's a zero-sum game." Richard's hope soured into something darker. "You're saying I'd have to kill someone?" Jonas shook his head. "Number, you don't have to lift a finger. Fate will choose. You'll never know who, or when, or how. But someone will die. That is the price." Richard's mind whirled, the weight of Jonas's words sinking in. It was a bargain, one that offered a twisted kind of power, but with consequences far beyond his control. He could save people, yes, but at what cost? "Why do you think we're here?" Jonas asked, his voice low, almost conspiratorial. "We see death, but we choose when and where to act. The power isn't in avoiding fate, it's in shaping it." Richard left the warehouse that night with more questions than answers, but one thing had become clear. His visions were not just some cruel joke of the universe. They were part of something larger, something darker, something that could not be undone. For the next week, he couldn't stop thinking about what Jonas had said. Could he live with the consequences of changing someone's fate? Could he bear the burden of knowing that saving one life meant condemning another? His answer came soon enough. One afternoon, sitting in his office, he caught sight of a young intern passing by. She was new, fresh-faced and eager, and when he looked at her, he saw it. Her death, brutal and violent, just days away. A robbery gone wrong, her throat cut as she tried to fight off an attacker in the parking lot. Richard closed his eyes, feeling the weight of Jonas's words pressing down on him. He knew what he had to do. That night, he found the same online forum and posted a single word: ready. Chapter 4. The night Richard saw his own death, the air in his house felt wrong, stale, thick, as if the walls themselves were choking him. He had come to expect the visions by now, but nothing could have prepared him for this. It had started like any other evening, another whiskey, another mindless attempt to drown out the noise, another moment staring into nothing as the world outside his windows continued its indifferent grind. But then he caught his reflection in the bathroom mirror, and everything changed. The glass was dirty, smudged from months of neglect, but that didn't matter. What he saw there, who he saw, was unmistakable. A figure loomed behind him in the reflection, shrouded in darkness, its features hidden. But what stood out, what froze the blood in Richard's veins, was the glint of a knife, long, sharp, and already stained red. The blade swung down, plunging deep into his back, over and over again, with a fury that was terrifying in its silence. He saw his own face in the mirror, pale, twisted with pain and fear, as the life drained out of him. The countdown ticked away in his mind, as clearly as if it were etched into his skull. 1 week, 7 days before it would all end. The vision ended as abruptly as it had come, but Richard was left trembling, gasping for breath, like he'd just escaped drowning. His reflection now stared back at him, hollow-eyed, haunted, but alone. He stumbled back into the living room, hands shaking, barely able to hold on to his drink. He sank into the couch, the whiskey sloshing in the glass, but the familiar burn of alcohol did nothing to quiet the fear clenching around his throat. He had seen death before, countless times in countless faces, but never his own, never so close, so real. Richard had always known, on some level, that the visions were a curse, but this was different. This was personal. For the first time, it wasn't just a glimpse into someone else's inevitable fate. It was his. It wasn't someone in the distance, someone he could warn or try to save. It was him, trapped in a house that was suddenly too small, too tight, too dangerous. The mirror was only the beginning. By morning, Richard was a wreck. He hadn't slept, the scene replaying over and over again in his mind. The knife, the figure, the finality of it all. 7 days. The sense of dread followed him everywhere. He tried to distract himself. He pored over books, scoured the internet, reached out to the forums again, but nothing, no one, had an answer that could stop what was coming. Jonas had warned him, hadn't he? The rules were simple. Death couldn't be changed, only manipulated, and it had finally come for him. But it wasn't just fear that gripped him. There was something else, something deeper. Paranoia. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind rattling the windows felt like a warning. The house seemed alive with it, the walls pressing in on him, suffocating him with the knowledge that he couldn't escape. Richard began to change. He stopped going to work. What was the point? He couldn't concentrate anyway. The thought of sitting in his office, surrounded by people who might be marked by death, or worse, the person who would kill him, was unbearable. The same dull routine that had once felt safe now felt like a death trap. He boarded up the windows first. He didn't know why exactly, but the idea of anyone being able to peer inside, to watch him, made his skin crawl. He nailed the boards in place, blocking out the light, making the house darker, colder. It became his prison, a self-imposed fortress against whatever was out there, waiting to deliver the final blow. Anne was the next to go. At first, she had tried to help. She pleaded with him to talk, to explain what was going on, but Richard had long since passed the point where words made sense. How could he explain to her what he didn't fully understand himself? She grew suspicious of his every move, of his late nights locked in the bathroom, the frantic hammering at the windows, the whispers he sometimes spoke to himself. She had grown used to his distance, to his withdrawal, but this was something different, something dangerous. One night, after another argument, she packed a bag. "I can't do this anymore, Richard," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "I don't know what's going on with you, but you need help. Real help. Not this." She gestured to the boarded-up windows, to the disarray that had overtaken the house, to the man who had become a ghost of himself. Richard didn't answer. He didn't try to stop her as she left, the door slamming shut behind her, the sound echoing in the empty house. He was alone now, alone with his thoughts, his fear, his growing madness. The days bled into one another, the countdown in his head becoming louder, more insistent. 4 days left. 3, 2. He stopped sleeping altogether, pacing the house in the dead of night, the shadows growing longer, deeper, until he could no longer tell where they ended and he began. The mirror. He kept returning to it, though he didn't want to. It had become an obsession. Every time he looked, he expected to see the figure again, the knife, the end. But it was always just his reflection staring back at him, gaunt, pale, eyes sunken from lack of sleep. He stopped eating. He stopped drinking anything but whiskey. The dark, bitter liquid was the only thing that seemed to dull the edges, to keep the fear at bay for a little while. But even that wasn't enough anymore. The fear had burrowed too deep, taken root in every part of him. It was in his blood now, pumping through his veins, spreading like a virus. The house itself seemed to shift around him. It creaked and groaned in the night, the walls too close, the ceiling too low. The air felt heavy, thick, pressing down on him with an invisible weight. The whispers started next, soft at first, barely audible, like the wind moving through the cracks in the boards. But soon, they grew louder, insistent, echoing in his head. It's coming. He knew it was. He could feel it, like a shadow creeping up behind him, always just out of reach, always watching. And then, the final day arrived. Richard woke up in a cold sweat, heart pounding in his chest. 1 day left, 24 hours. He stared at the clock, watching the minutes tick by, each second bringing him closer to the end. He had done everything he could to protect himself, boarded up the house, locked every door, blocked out the world. But it didn't matter. The vision had been clear. It would happen here, in this house, and nothing he did would stop it. He spent the day in silence, pacing the house like a man awaiting his execution. His hands trembled, his breath came in shallow gasps, but there was nothing left to do. No one left to save him, no way out. That night, as the clock ticked toward midnight, Richard found himself standing in front of the mirror again. He stared at his reflection, waiting, knowing that any moment now it would come. The figure, the knife, his death. But this time, there was nothing. Just his reflection, staring back at him, hollow, broken. A man who had already died 1,000 times in his mind. And then, from behind him, a soft creak, a footstep. Richard froze, his breath catching in his throat. In the mirror, the figure appeared again, stepping out of the shadows, the knife gleaming in the dim light. It was real. It was here. He turned, his heart racing, but there was nothing there. Only the dark, empty house. Only the silence. But in the mirror, the figure moved closer, the knife raised, and Richard screamed. Chapter 5. Richard hadn't eaten in days. The whiskey bottles littering the kitchen floor were his only companions now, their dull clink echoing through the empty house each time he stumbled through the narrow halls. The boards on the windows kept the outside world at bay, but inside, the suffocating darkness had grown thicker, heavier, pressing down on him like an invisible hand. The clock ticked louder now, its steady rhythm counting down to the moment he had been dreading since that night in front of the mirror. Every minute felt like an eternity, yet the time was slipping through his fingers faster than he could grasp it. The vision had been so clear, so certain. He had barricaded himself inside the house, trying to stave off what he knew was inevitable. But deep down, he could feel it. Fate was closing in. And then, just before midnight, the knock came. At first, Richard thought it was in his head, just another hallucination brought on by days of sleepless paranoia. But the knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. "Richard, I know you're in there." It was Carl. Richard froze, the hair on the back of his neck standing on end. Carl, his best friend, the one whose death he had foreseen, the crash, the twisted wreckage, the blood. Carl had 2 years left. Why was he here now? The door rattled violently, as if Carl was throwing his full weight against it. "Richard, open up," he shouted, his voice edged with desperation. "I need to talk to you." Richard didn't move. He stood there, heart pounding in his chest, staring at the door as if it were a portal to his own doom. Something felt wrong. Carl had grown distant after the last time they spoke, when Richard had tried to warn him about the accident. His warning had only driven Carl away, making him bitter, angry. Now, Carl sounded desperate, unhinged. "Open the damn door," Carl yelled, banging harder now. "I need to know what you saw." The door frame cracked, and before Richard could react, the door burst open, and Carl was standing in the entryway, his face twisted with rage and fear. His eyes were wild, his clothes disheveled, and in his hand was a gleaming kitchen knife. Richard's stomach lurched. "Carl," he stammered, backing away instinctively. "What are you doing? Why are you here?" Carl stormed inside, slamming the door behind him. His gaze was fixed on Richard, furious, accusing. "You did this," Carl spat, pointing the knife at him. "You ruined everything. You told me I was going to die in that accident. You made me see it, made me feel it, and now it's all I can think about. I can't sleep, I can't live, I can't do anything because all I can see is my own goddamn death." Richard's mind raced. This wasn't supposed to happen. Carl's death was years away. He wasn't supposed to be here tonight. But something had changed. Something Richard had done. It was all unraveling. "Carl, I was trying to warn you." "Warn me?" Carl laughed bitterly. "You cursed me. You put that image in my head, and now I'm stuck with it. Everywhere I go, I see the crash, feel the impact, hear the glass shattering. You did this, Richard. You did this to me." Carl took a step forward, the knife trembling in his hand. "You think you can just see death and not pay a price? You think you can control it?" Richard backed away, heart racing. "I never tried to control it, Carl. I can't control it. It's not me. It's just fate." "Fate?" Carl snarled. "That's your excuse? You could have told me it was all bullshit, that none of it was real, but no, you just let me live with it. You let me rot with it." Carl's voice broke, and Richard could see the fear underneath the anger, the desperation that had driven him here. But it was too late. The knife was in Carl's hand, gleaming under the dim light, and Richard knew with a sickening certainty that this was it. This was how it would end. "Please, Carl," Richard whispered, hands trembling in front of him. "Don't do this." Carl's face twisted in agony. "I need to know, Richard. I need to know how to stop it. You said you could see death, so change it. You can change it, right? You have to." "I can't," Richard pleaded. "I tried. You can't change fate without consequences. I didn't make this happen." "Then who did?" Carl roared. And before Richard could say another word, Carl lunged. The knife sliced through the air, and Richard felt a searing pain as it plunged into his side. He gasped, stumbling backward, clutching at the wound. But Carl wasn't done. The rage had taken over now, blinding him to anything but the terror that had consumed him for months. He struck again and again, each blow more frenzied, more violent, until Richard collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath, blood pooling beneath him. The vision, it was playing out exactly as he had seen it. The figure in the mirror, the knife, the brutal stabbing. It had been Carl all along. It was always Carl. As the life drained out of him, Richard lay on the cold floor, his mind spinning with the horrible truth. He had done this. Not directly, but by trying to fight fate, by trying to change the unchangeable. He had set the events in motion that led to his own death. He had warned Carl. He had planted the seed of fear. And in doing so, he had created the monster that now stood over him, knife in hand. This was never about avoiding fate. It was about accepting it. But Richard had been too afraid to see that. He had tried to play God, and now he was paying the price. As his vision blurred, his breathing shallow, Richard's eyes drifted toward the mirror hanging on the wall. In the reflection, he saw Carl standing over him, knife in hand, panting heavily. But Carl wasn't looking at Richard anymore. He was staring into the mirror, his face pale, eyes wide with horror. Carl saw something in that reflection, something Richard knew all too well. His own death. The curse had passed on. With his last breath, Richard watched as Carl staggered backward, the realization sinking in. The cycle would continue. It always did. Richard's body grew cold, his vision darkening, the weight of inevitability crushing him as his life slipped away. And then, silence. The room was still. Carl stood alone, staring at the blood-soaked knife in his hand, the reflection of his own doomed fate staring back at him from the mirror. The countdown had begun anew.